Welcome to the craziest and most comprehensive performance testing video that we have ever done, where we're gonna show you exactly how fast the new M4 Max MacBook Pro truly is. Because here in front of me, I have the M1 Max, the M2 Max, the M3 Max, and of course the M4. And not only that, but we're also gonna test the battery life. All of them are charged up to 100%, and you can see the battery health opened up on each one. We have maximum capacity 100% on both the M4 Max and the M3 Max, yes, 100, while the M2 Max has 93% and the M1 Max has 86. So with these two, it's not gonna be a direct battery comparison, but it should kind of give you an idea of how much better battery life you'll get if you currently have one of these old machines and you upgrade to the new M4 Max. So let me go ahead and unplug each one of these machines so we can get started on this battery test. First things first is the spec sheet. Here are all four of the models side by side, and you can see that they all have the base level of RAM that's required to fully upgrade the CPU and GPU. Yes, this is fully unbinned across the board, and they all have a 1TB SSD. Now jumping right into performance, the first thing we're gonna do is compare the SSD disk speeds, and take a look here. Surprisingly, the M1 Max with the 1TB SSD has the fastest read speeds, 5400. That means that Apple has actually lowered the quality of the SSDs with these newer models. But in terms of the read speed, it has gotten faster with each generation just by a little bit, going up to 6286 on the M4 Max. And of course, you also gotta consider that all three of these previous Mac models have Thunderbolt 4 ports, while the new M4 Max has Thunderbolt 5 ports. And now let's jump into Geekbench 6. We're gonna test the CPU performance, and the main thing to know here is the clock speed differences. The M1 Max clocks up to 3.22 gigahertz. We have 3.68 on the M2 Max, 4.05 on the M3 Max, and 4.5 on the M4 Max. So let's go ahead and start the CPU test. And while this is running, let me just mention that all of these are running on high power mode, and they're all updated to macOS Sequoia 15.1, the latest update for the macOS itself and all the software in this video. And here you go, we have our scores, and you can see with the single core, the M4 Max is almost twice as fast as the M1 Max. And in terms of progression, it was pretty linear from the M1 to the M2 to the M3. The M4 got a big boost. And then in terms of multi-core, holy smokes guys, over twice as high performance on the M4 Max compared to the M1 Max. The M2 Max was definitely a stopgap, it barely got faster. The M3 Max was a lot faster because it got a bunch of extra performance cores, 4 of them. And surprisingly, the M4 Max, even with the same core counts as the M3 Max, it's so much faster. So that brings us to Speedometer 3.0, which basically tests the snappiness and speed of web browsing and web-based apps. And here you can see that the M4 Max is 56% faster in terms of web browsing than the M1 Max, and the other two are right there in the middle. And how does that translate into real-world web-based app performance? Well, we have Figma right here. This is a web design app, and this project is designed by 500 Designs, one of the best studios out of California. So what I'm gonna do is export 12 of these high-quality layers and see what performance differences we can get. We got our results, and the M1 Max took 1 minute and 54 seconds. The M2 Max shaved off 19 seconds from that time, but the M3 Max only saved 8 seconds, so that's a bit of a kind of stopgap upgrade in terms of this test. But M4 Max, 1 minute and 6 seconds. That's 73% faster than the original M1 Max. With that said, let's move on to Xcode programming. You're welcome, all the programmers out there. This is gonna be awesome. Let's see how much faster the M4 Max is. We have our results right here, and whoa, this was not expected. The M1 Max took 150 seconds. The M2 Max took 128, so that shaved off 22 seconds. The M3 Max took only 91 seconds. That's 37 seconds savings compared to the M2 Max. That's a big deal. And the M4 Max finally, 84 seconds. That's only 7 seconds faster than the M3 Max, probably because it has the same core count as the M3 Max. This one right here was the one that got a bunch of extra performance cores. That's why we're seeing such a big difference. But the M4 Max is faster than the craziest M2 Ultra, so that's a big deal. And yes, we didn't forget about you music producer folks out there. We have our Logic Pro benchmark. And we have some very interesting results here. We just did a bunch of testing and we found the maximum tracks you can play at a single time. 185 for the M1 Max, 194 for the M2 Max. The M3 Max got 330 tracks. Massive improvement, of course, because of the extra 4 performance cores. But what shocked me the most is the new M4 Max. 405 tracks at the same time with the same core layout as the M3 Max. These new cores are absolutely insane. And the benefit of having 405 tracks is that for regular use and regular music production, there's so much overhead on the CPU that it's gonna run great completely silent without using the fans. This is amazing. And now let's move on to graphics testing. This is Geekbench 6 Metal. Let's see how much better the M4 Max is with the same number of cores. We have our results here, and this is very interesting because going from the M1 Max to the M2 Max, there's a 19% boost, probably because the core count went up from 32 to 38. Now going from the M2 Max to the M3 Max, that was about 12% faster. And then the M4, surprisingly, 17.5% faster than the M3 Max with the same 40 core GPU. That is extremely impressive. So how is it possible for the M4 Max to be so much faster? Well, it might just be that they're pushing a lot more power to the chip. So to test that, we have 3D Mark's Wildlife Extreme Unlimited Test, which in my experience uses the most amount of peak GPU power. We have MX Power Gadget open to monitor exactly that. So let's get testing. More power. The M1 Max took 45.96 watts peak, 50.92 on the M2 Max, 67 watts peak on the M3 Max, and 84.35 watts on the M4 Max. That's 25% more peak power with the same 40 GPU cores. However, with that 25% extra power, it only gave us 18% higher FPS. The M3 Max's 40 core GPU used 32% more power than the 38 core on the M2 Max, while only giving you 28% higher performance. And surprisingly, the most efficient upgrade was actually the M2 Max, which used only 11% more power than the M1 Max, but gave us 25% more FPS. And in terms of a more realistic benchmark, Steel Nomad Lite actually is the most modern benchmark that's meant to give you like a real world gaming workload. So let's run this test. We got the results, and holy smokes, guys, the M4 Max is now over twice as fast as the M1 Max in terms of FPS. 105.4, which is crazy. Let's move on to 3D rendering in Blender. This is the latest 4.2.3 update. This is where the GPU performance matters the most. There are so many people that do 3D rendering, and you basically need as much GPU power as you can get. So let's render this Party Tug project. Holy smokes, guys, this is perhaps the biggest difference I've seen across the board. 1 minute 49 seconds for the M1 Max, 1 minute for the M2 Max, so almost twice as fast. 30 seconds for the M3 Max, literally twice as fast as the M2 Max. That's because Apple added in hardware ray tracing cores, and 24 seconds for the M4 Max. Not that much faster. Yes, it is 20% faster, which does sound pretty good, but literally the biggest difference here is between the M2 Max and the M3 Max, and you're not saving that much time with the M4 Max, so maybe consider potentially buying a used M3 Max off of somebody who's selling it for a great deal, trying to buy the new M4 Max, because this thing right here has the best bang for the buck. And now let's move on to Cinebench 2024, where we're gonna do our stress testing for the CPU. But first, they do have their GPU test, which also takes advantage of ray tracing, and I'm just gonna run it one time just to give you guys a fancy, nice little chart that you can come back to. By the way, if you enjoyed all the charting and work we're putting in, subscribe because this took a lot of effort and we're gonna do a lot more testing after this. We got the results and we're getting the same 20% improvement for the M4 Max compared to the M3 Max. Surprisingly, right here we have 2.2 times faster M3 Max versus M2 Max. And this time there was only about a 30% improvement for the M2 Max versus the M1 Max, but there you go. And now let's do the multi-core stress test. This is a 10-minute throttling test. We're gonna see which ones actually throttle and which ones don't. So let's start it on both of these and both of these. We also have MX Power Gadget to take a look at the temps. Right here, we can see we're already hitting 57 watts on the M4 Max compared to about 51, 52. All right, guys, I'm already seeing throttling on the M4 Max for sure. Look, it dipped down from close to 60 watts down to 50. Even on the M3 Max, I saw a little bit of a drop there in terms of throttling, especially there. Look at that 50 watts. It's already throttling. And you could see that in terms of the peak performance core clock speed. We're now down to 3.44 on the M3 Max. We're also down to 3.77 on the M4 Max. While here on the M2 Max and the M1 Max, they're glued to full performance, 3.26 all-core peak clock speed on the M2 Max, 3.04 all-core on the M1 Max. And the fans are going nuts over here on the right side. Look at that, 4,700 RPM, 5,000 RPM, while the two on the left are very silent, only like 1,500, 1,700 RPMs on those. So let me open up this chart right here. You guys can see maxed out fans on both of these. Look at that. Both the M3 Max and M4 Max fully maxed out, while the M1 Max basically idling with the fans. That's so funny because it uses so little power, 28 watts right now, while the M2 Max, it's kicked up a little bit, about 2,000 on each side in terms of the fans. Still glued to full performance, no throttling, using about 37 watts for the CPU. Going back here, it looks like the performance recovered a little bit in terms of the clock speeds and the wattage, but the fans are just so loud. So the crazy thing is that over the course of these generations, the M4 Max is using up to a peak of 65 watts in power compared to just about 30 on the M1 Max. That's basically double or more than double with the same exact cooling system. They haven't really updated it at all, which is why these fans are kicking up so fast and so high. And now that the fans have been running for a while, it's gotten rid of any chassis heat soaking or anything, and now the clock speeds are running at full performance, 3.89 for all of the performance cores, which is impressive on the M4 Max, and 3.58 on the M3 Max. So the fans are helping it stay at full performance. Holy smokes, guys, I just realized this. If this is throttling with 100% CPU workload in a 16-inch chassis, we haven't even done a mixed CPU and GPU test yet. That's gonna throttle. But if this is throttling, what about the 14-inch? The 14-inch M4 Max? Holy smokes, that's gonna throttle like crazy. And look here, guys, we're actually cooling off on the fan speed with the M3 Max. Now it's only about 4,000 RPM. The M4 Max is still full throttle with the fans. So if you don't like a loud laptop, sorry for everybody buying the M4 Max. Now time to check the thermals. We have our Seek Thermal Cam. Let's see the hottest spot on the M1 Max. Look at that, 41 degrees Celsius right in the center. Moving over to the M2 Max, 43 degrees Celsius. Whoa, look at that. The M3 Max, 38 degrees Celsius is the hottest point because the fans were ramped up so much. The chassis is cool. And for the M4 Max, 38 degrees Celsius. It's even hotter, even with the fans maxed out the entire time. That's a lot of heat. The test is finally finished. We have our scores. We have 796 for the M1 Max, 931 for the M2 Max, 1635 for the M3 Max, and 1996 for the M4 Max. So with this using 2 times more power than the M1 Max, it actually is 2.5 times faster in terms of CPU rendering. That's a pretty dang good update. The M2 Max was 17% better than the M1 Max. The M3 Max was 76% better than the M2 Max. That was by far the best upgrade in terms of the CPU, and the M4 Max is 22% better than the M3 Max. So great if you consider the fact that the core layout is the same, but it's not as big of a deal as previously. With that out of the way, let's get into photo editing with Lightroom Classic. We're actually gonna do two different tests here, one of them with 50 photos in terms of exporting, and another with 500 for a thermal throttling test. This is something that only Max Tech can do, guys. We need 2 people. We got Max here. All right, ready?
Yep.
All right, export. Starting our timers. We got the times, guys. 34 seconds for the M1 Max, 28 for the M2 Max, 21 seconds for the M3 Max, 19 seconds for the M4 Max. That is insanely fast. I remember when we started doing this test, it used to take a few minutes every time, but with updates and GPU rendering support, and with the M4 Max, 19 seconds. This is why we have to do a bigger 500 export test. But before I start the test, I do want to mention that the M4 Max was about 10% faster than the M3 Max and about 79% faster than the M1 Max. So this is gonna show if it's gonna throttle with that big test. So we started the test, and right off the bat, I can see that both the M1 Max and M2 Max are basically fully pushing the P cores. They're glued to their maximums, but over here on the right side, we're getting CPU throttling on both the M3 Max and M4 Max, and in some cases, I saw the clock speed on the M4 Max being lower than the M3 Max, which means more throttling now that we're using the CPU and GPU at the same time. And wait, never mind, looking at these two, they are starting to slow down slightly. You can see those little spikes up and down. Since we're using CPU and GPU, it's a lot of power. We're getting a tiny bit of throttling here. All right, the weird thing here, guys, is that we seem to be getting some kind of weird throttling on the M3 Max, like the CPU and GPU usage is kind of seemingly going down, and the temps is only look 79 degrees Celsius, so something is throttling the system, and I thought maybe it could be the RAM, but most likely it's the memory bandwidth, which is a lot faster on the new M4 Max, which is why it's ahead, even without having to push that much power to CPU and GPU. The test is finished, and this was insane. The M1 Max took 8 minutes, 32 seconds. The M2 Max took 8 minutes, 57 seconds, so 25 seconds slower. The M3 Max took 5 minutes and 51 seconds, and the M4 Max took 4 minutes and 32 seconds. The crazy thing here is that the M4 Max performed even better in the 500 photo test compared to 50. It was 88% faster than the M1 Max, almost twice as fast, and compared to the M3 Max, it was 29% faster. How could this be, considering that we had no thermal throttling in terms of the temps? All of them ended at about 79 degrees Celsius, so something else was throttling the systems, and I have a feeling it's the memory bandwidth, which we got a huge upgrade with the M4 Max, about 546 gigabytes per second compared to 400 on the M3 Max. That could explain how it's doing so much better. The battery's getting really low, so let's take a look at the battery before we get into our final test, which is video editing. Both the M1 Max and the M2 Max are sitting at 11% battery. That's pretty much 3 hours of heavy workload testing on all these machines. They're both at 11, even though the M1 Max was more degraded, if you remember, in terms of battery health. So that means the M2 Max does use a little bit more power. Now going over here, the M3 Max is at 28%. Really, really impressive. And the M4 Max is at 21%. So the M4 Max does use more power than the M3 Max, but keep in mind this was really heavy testing, so if you were actually doing a lot of simple tasks like web browsing and simple apps, I'd say that the M4 Max would probably have the best battery life out of all of these. And in case you're worried about the battery life going down, upgrading from an M1 Max to an M4 with heavy testing, you don't have to worry, it still does pretty well. Now jumping into video editing, we've upgraded to Final Cut 11 on all of these machines. And this right here is a 5-minute HEVC 4K project. This is basically what probably 90% of people are gonna be filming and editing in. It's a very common format and codec, just like H.264. And here you can see we're playing back with film grain and LUTs applied, and you can see just how little of the GPU is being used. You can see the M2 Max is using less than the M1 Max, and the M4 Max is using less than the M3 Max, which means it has more overhead for effects. But let's do an export test to see if the encoders have improved. And yep, would you look at that, after 4 generations, Apple has finally improved the encoders. Only a minute to export this 5-minute clip on the M4 Max, while the rest of these all took a minute and 9 seconds. No improvements whatsoever in terms of encoders. Finally, we get a little bit of an improvement. So for regular video editing, this is by far the least worth it to upgrade to a newer machine, because even if you have a 20-minute project, that's only 36 seconds saved on the M4 Max compared to these other ones. And in terms of timeline smoothness, all of them handle it so easily. And now let's move on to another test. This is actually magnetic mask AI tracking performance that we're gonna test. This is a 44-second clip of Canon C200 RAW. So let's go ahead and analyze on each one and look at the speed differences. All right, that was very, very interesting. The M4 Max finished in 2 minutes and 6 seconds. The M3 Max, 2 minutes and 20. The M2 Max, 3 minutes and 8 seconds, and the M1 Max, 3 minutes and 43 seconds. So all in all, the M4 Max was almost twice as fast. That's a pretty dang good difference if you're upgrading like me. I still have the M1 Max, so if you're doing a lot of this tracking, you can save a ton of time. So this chart right here basically represents all of the new AI features and any other AI stuff that you're gonna do on your MacBook Pro. You can see the M4 Max is a lot faster than these older systems, but compared to the M3 Max, it's not that big of a difference. So you could get away with just keeping this if you don't want to upgrade right now. And now for our final test, let's make this into a 5-minute timeline and export it. This is extreme, very tough footage that pushes both the CPU and the GPU. We got our results, and this is pretty crazy. The M1 Max took 4 minutes and 4 seconds. The M2 Max took 3 minutes and 50 seconds. The M3 Max took 2 minutes and 52 seconds. And the M4 Max took 2 minutes and 27 seconds. Now, the big takeaway here is if you looked at the chart on the M1, you saw that the GPU history, the GPU usage wasn't fully maxed out, which means it was limited by the CPU not being fast enough. That's why it was slower than the M2 Max, which the M2 Max was actually GPU limited. It didn't have enough graphics performance. And both of these two right here, the M3 Max and the M4 Max, were actually encoder limited, meaning they had enough CPU performance, enough GPU performance. It was fully maxing out the encoder speed, even with the faster encoders on the M4 Max. So if you're a video editor that works with really tough formats or codecs or GPU heavy footage, you definitely want one of these two MacBook Pros right here. So there you guys go. That was a ton of testing, and based on everything that we ran, what kind of conclusion can we pull from this video? Well, first of all, if you still have an old M1 Max or M2 Max machine and you've been waiting to upgrade, you do get a pretty massive improvement with the new M4 Max and so many different tests. Yes, you're clear to finally upgrade, especially from the M1 Max, almost twice as fast in so many different tests. But if you currently have an M3 Max, honestly, it's not that big of an improvement going to the M4 Max. There's only a couple of things like photo editing with the higher memory bandwidth where it was 29% faster. That was a big improvement, but a lot of the other stuff was just a little bit faster, so I don't think it's worth it to upgrade from the M3 Max to the M4 Max. And in terms of overall value in my personal recommendation, seeing as the M4 Max does not have any new groundbreaking features like a new design, crazy display tech, or anything else like that, I would probably suggest just trying to find an M3 Max model that's discounted, because there are gonna be some sales on some old in-stock units that's gonna be the best bang for the buck you can get because it's such a huge jump over these two. I'm gonna leave a link to the best M3 Max MacBook Pro deal we can find on Amazon down below, as well as links for these other machines. So hopefully you enjoyed all this extensive testing. If you did, please subscribe. This was so much work and we have more videos coming soon. So thanks for watching and we'll see you in the next video.